The photograph arrived at our conservation lab in a manila envelope, sent by a descendant of a World War I veteran who'd found it while clearing out her grandmother's house. The note attached said simply, Company B, 372nd Infantry. Can you restore this? My great-grandfather is in it somewhere. I'm a photographic conservator specializing in military images, and I'd seen hundreds of photographs like this one. Formal company portraits from the Great War. Soldiers arranged in rows, rifles at their sides, faces serious with the weight of what they were about to face. This one was in rough shape. The paper had torn across the top. The emulsion was cracked and fading, and water damage had blurred sections of the image. But it was salvageable. I always said yes to military photographs. These men deserved to be remembered clearly. I began the restoration process, carefully scanning the image at high resolution before attempting any physical repairs. The photograph showed approximately 30 soldiers, arranged in 3 rows, standing, kneeling, and sitting. They were black soldiers, I noted, which made sense. The 372nd Infantry Regiment had been one of the African-American units that served with distinction in France during World War I, though they'd fought under French command because the US Army's segregation policies had relegated them to support roles. At the bottom of the photograph, someone had written in white paint, Company B, 372nd Infantry. As I worked on the digital restoration, cleaning up the damage and enhancing the faded areas, the soldiers' faces began to emerge with greater clarity. Young men, most of them, probably in their late teens or early 20s. Some looked confident, others uncertain. A few smiled slightly despite the formal nature of the portrait. I was nearly finished with the digital work when I noticed something odd about one soldier in the back row, standing slightly to the left of center. His image was unusually faint compared to the others, almost translucent in places. At first, I thought it was just worse damage in that area. But as I examined it more closely, I realized the fading wasn't consistent with water damage or age. It looked more like a double exposure, as though he'd been photographed separately and superimposed onto the group. But that didn't make sense. Unit photographs were taken all at once, everyone standing still for the exposure. There was no reason to add someone in later. I enhanced that section of the image, adjusting contrast and brightness. The soldier's features became clearer. A young man, maybe 19 or 20, with a solemn expression. His uniform was identical to the others, his rifle held at the same angle. But there was something about the light on him that was wrong. The shadows fell differently on his face, as though he'd been lit from another direction. And his eyes, even through the aged photograph, even through the damage and fading, his eyes looked wrong, hollow, empty. Like he was looking at something the camera couldn't see. I made notes about the anomaly and continued with the physical restoration, carefully repairing the torn paper and stabilizing the cracked emulsion. When I was finished, I had both a restored physical print and a cleaned digital version. I sent both to the client, along with my notes about the restoration process. Her response came 2 days later, and her message made my hands go cold. Thank you so much for the restoration. My great-grandfather is in the front row, third from left. But I need to ask you about something. The soldier in the back row, the one you noted looked faint. Do you know his name? Because according to the regimental records I found, that's Private Marcus Webb. He was killed in action on March 15th, 1918. But this photograph is dated March 22nd, 1918. On the back. A week after he died. I pulled up the high-resolution scan and zoomed in on the date notation I'd missed during my initial examination. There, in faded pencil, on the back of the original photograph. Co. B, 372nd Inth. March 22nd, 1918. Camp Upton. Camp Upton was in New York, a training facility where troops assembled before shipping to France. The photograph had been taken stateside, before the company deployed. But Private Marcus Webb had died March 15, 1918. A week before this photograph was taken. I sat back from my computer, my mind racing. There had to be an explanation. Maybe the date was wrong. Maybe Webb had died later and the records were incorrect. Maybe the faint figure in the back row wasn't Webb at all, just another soldier who happened to look similar. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong with this photograph. I wrote back to the client. Do you have any other information about Private Webb? Any letters, documents, or family stories? Her response came quickly. Not much. He was my great-grandmother's brother. She rarely talked about him. I found one letter he'd written to his mother from Camp Upton. It's dated March 10, 1918. He said he was feeling ill, that the camp doctor had examined him but said it was just a cold. He wrote that he hoped to be better by the time they took the company photograph the following week. The following week. The photograph had been taken the following week, but Webb hadn't lived to see it. I asked if I could see the letter and any other documents she had. She scanned and sent me everything she'd found in her grandmother's papers. The letter from March 10, a telegram informing the family of Webb's death, a newspaper clipping from the local black newspaper announcing his death, and a worn funeral program. The telegram was dated March 16, 1918. The Secretary of War desires me to express his deep regret that Private Marcus Webb died at Camp Upton, New York, March 15, 1918, from influenza and pneumonia. The Spanish flu. It had to be. The pandemic that would eventually kill more people than the war itself had been spreading through military camps in early 1918. Webb had mentioned feeling ill in his letter. 5 days later, he was dead. But somehow, he appeared in a photograph taken a week after his death. I contacted a colleague who specialized in the history of the 372nd Infantry. Dr. Raymond Foster was a professor at Howard University who'd written extensively about black soldiers in World War I. I sent him the restored photograph and explained the situation. He called me within an hour. I know this photograph, he said immediately. Or rather, I know of it. I've never seen an actual copy, but it's mentioned in several soldiers' letters. They called it the ghost photograph. The ghost photograph. Company B took their formal portrait on March 22, 1918, as scheduled. But several soldiers claimed that when the photograph was developed, it showed Marcus Webb standing in the back row. Webb had died the week before from the flu. Some of the men were spooked by it. Others said it was fitting, that Webb had wanted so badly to be in the photograph that he'd somehow appeared in it anyway. I felt a chill run through me. What happened to the photograph? According to the letters, the company commander wanted to destroy it, thought it would be bad for morale. But some of the soldiers insisted on keeping it. They felt like Webb deserved to be remembered with his company, even if he hadn't lived to deploy with them. There was apparently quite an argument about it. Do the letters say anything else about Webb's appearance in the photograph? Dr. Foster was quiet for a moment. One soldier, Private James Booker, wrote to his sister about it. He said Webb looked thin as smoke in the photograph, like he was already fading away. Booker said it reminded him that they were all close to death. Every day, whether from the flu or from the war they were about to fight. He said Webb was lucky in a way. He'd died in his own country, among friends, not in some French field far from home. After the call, I examined the photograph again, with new understanding. Marcus Webb stood in the back row, faint and translucent, his eyes hollow and distant. A young man who'd died of influenza in a military camp, who'd never made it to France, never seen combat, never had the chance to prove himself in the war he'd volunteered to fight. But he'd made it into his company photograph. Somehow, impossibly, he'd been present for that moment. I started researching the other men in the photograph, trying to piece together their stories. Company B of the 372nd Infantry had deployed to France in April 1918 and had fought in several major engagements. They'd served with distinction under French command, earning the Croix de Guerre, but they'd also suffered heavy casualties. I found casualty lists, after-action reports, and personal accounts. Of the 30 soldiers visible in the photograph, 12 had been killed in action in France. 7 more had been wounded. 3 had died from disease while overseas. Only 8 had returned home without serious injury. The photograph showed them before they knew what was coming, before they'd crossed the Atlantic, before they'd seen the trenches, the gas, the artillery, the machine guns. They looked so young, so uncertain about what lay ahead. And standing among them, already dead, was Marcus Webb. I kept working on the image, unable to leave it alone. I enhanced different sections, bringing out details that had been invisible in the damaged original. The soldiers' expressions became clearer. The texture of their uniforms emerged. The wooden barracks behind them sharpened into focus. That's when I noticed something else. In the window of the barracks, barely visible behind the assembled soldiers, was another face. Pale and indistinct, watching the photograph being taken. I enhanced that section, my heart pounding. It was another soldier, not in formation, not part of the company portrait, just watching from inside the building. And, like Webb, his image was faint, translucent. Wrong. I cross-referenced the casualty lists again, looking for soldiers who'd died at Camp Upton before the photograph was taken. I found 2 more names. Private Joseph Coleman, died March 8, 1918. Influenza. Private Thomas Wright, died March 12, 1918. Pneumonia. The Spanish flu had been tearing through the camp in March 1918, killing young soldiers before they ever got to France. I examined the photograph more carefully, looking for other anomalies. Were there other faint figures I'd missed? Other dead soldiers who'd somehow appeared in this image? I found one more. A shadow at the far left edge of the frame, barely visible, where no one should have been standing. When I enhanced it, I could make out the suggestion of a uniform, an arm, part of a face, but it was too degraded to identify clearly. 4 dead soldiers in a photograph of the living. Or possibly 4. Or all of them killed by the flu that had ravaged the camp in the weeks before deployment. I contacted Dr. Foster again and told him what I'd found. "It makes a terrible kind of sense," he said quietly. Camp Upton was hit hard by the flu in early 1918. The official records show 9 deaths in Company B between February and March, all from influenza or related pneumonia. But the camp was chaotic, and record-keeping was poor. There might have been more. "Why would they appear in the photograph?" I asked. Maybe they didn't. Maybe it's just artifacts of the photographic process, light leaks, developing errors, coincidental shadows that we're interpreting as faces because we know the context. "But you don't believe that?" He sighed. "No, I don't. I've spent 20 years researching these soldiers, reading their letters, trying to understand their experiences. And one thing that comes through again and again is how much they wanted to be remembered. They knew they were going to war. They knew many of them wouldn't come back. They wanted their lives to matter, their service to be acknowledged. Maybe the ones who died before deployment wanted that even more, because they never got the chance to prove themselves in battle." "So you think they somehow appeared in the photograph? They're ghosts, or spirits, or whatever you want to call them?" "I think grief and memory and longing can do strange things. I think the men of Company B wanted to remember their dead comrades. And maybe in that wanting, in that moment when the photographer's shutter opened, something happened. Something that captured more than just the physical body standing there. Something that captured the desire to be remembered, to be included, to matter." I thought about that for a long time after we hung up. I looked at the photograph again, the clear, solid figures of the living soldiers, and the faint, ghostly presence of the dead. All of them part of Company B, 372nd Infantry. All of them deserving to be remembered. I sent the client a complete report of my findings, including the enhanced images showing the additional faint figures. I explained what Dr. Foster had told me about the camp's flu outbreak and the stories about the ghost photograph. Her response was brief but moving. "Thank you for this. I'm going to make copies for the whole family. My great-grandmother used to say her brother, Marcus, never really left home. She said he visited her in dreams sometimes, always in his uniform, always telling her he was all right. She said he promised her he'd be in the photograph with his company, even though he'd died before it was taken. Everyone thought grief had made her imagine things. But maybe she was right. Maybe he kept his promise." The restored photograph now hangs in the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. The museum was interested in it both for its historical value, documenting the service of black soldiers in World War I, and for the anomalies I'd discovered during restoration. The placard next to it reads, "Company B, 372nd Infantry Regiment, Camp Upton, New York, March 22nd, 1918. 30 soldiers are visible in this photograph. 4 of them, including Private Marcus Webb, standing in the back row, had died from influenza before the photograph was taken. Their faint presence in the image has never been fully explained. Visitors often stop and stare at the photograph for a long time, trying to identify which figures are the ghostly ones. Some say they can see them clearly. Others see only solid soldiers, no ghosts at all. I've looked at that photograph hundreds of times now. I see both. I see the living soldiers, young and uncertain, about to face horrors they couldn't imagine. And I see the dead ones, faint as smoke, standing among their comrades, keeping the promise to be present for this moment. Sometimes I think about the nature of photographs. They're supposed to capture reality, to freeze a moment in time with objective accuracy. But what is reality, really? Is it only the physical, the tangible, the things we can touch? Or does it include memory, longing, love, the fierce desire to be remembered? Maybe the camera that day at Camp Upton captured something more true than mere physical presence. Maybe it captured the bonds between these soldiers, the promise they'd made to each other, to stand together, no matter what. And maybe death wasn't enough to break that promise. Company B deployed to France in April 1918. They fought in the Meuse-Argonne offensive, one of the bloodiest battles in American history. 12 more soldiers from the company photograph died there. But they died as soldiers, in combat, doing the job they'd trained for. Marcus Webb and the others who died at Camp Upton never got that chance. They died in barracks beds, burning with fever, gasping for breath, never seeing France or the enemy, or the war they'd volunteered to fight. But they made it into the photograph. They stood with their company one last time. And now, more than a century later, they're still there, still standing in formation with their brothers, still present, still remembered. I've done a lot of photographic restoration in my career. I've brought clarity to thousands of faded images, rescued countless memories from the decay of time. But this photograph, the ghost photograph of Company B, 372nd Infantry, remains the most powerful I've ever worked on. Because it reminds me that photographs don't just capture what was there. Sometimes they capture what should have been there, what wanted to be there, what promised to be there, even if death stood in the way. Marcus Webb died on March 15, 1918, in a military camp in New York, far from any battlefield. But on March 22, 1918, he kept his promise to his sister. He was present when his company took their formal photograph. And he'll be there, faint as smoke, but undeniably present, for as long as the photograph survives, standing with his brothers, standing in formation, standing ready, even in death, to be remembered with the company he never got to serve with in life. That's the power of a photograph. That's the power of memory. That's the power of a promise kept. even when keeping it should have been impossible. Company B, 372nd Infantry. 30 soldiers in the photograph. 26 living. 4 dead. All of them present. All of them deserving to be remembered. All of them, in the end, home.